Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
We're going to start. I'm AJ Brush, and I'm co-hosting this talk with Rob Reeder, who's right there and will wave to all of you. And we are delighted to welcome Heather Richter-Lipford, who I met when she was Heather Richter when we were both actually in a doctoral, what is that called?
Doctoral consortium?
Consortium, when we were students back in the day. She's now a professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where she co-directs the HCI lab and does research on usable security and privacy. And today she's going to talk about privacy on social networks. Thanks.
Thank you very much for coming and for coming to the talk today. So I'll start off with a couple of interesting quotes here. A few months ago, the founder of Facebook gave an interesting statement defending their recent moves to make more information public on Facebook by saying that, well, the social norms have changed. People are now much more comfortable sharing a lot more information with more people, so those changes are really just about reflecting the current social norms. And you've probably all heard various quotes in the media on things like, well, you know, privacy is dead, get over it. You know, if you really don't want something to be known, you know, perhaps you shouldn't be doing it or you shouldn't be putting it online in the first place. And a lot of these attitudes seem to be reflected in the behavior of users on social network sites. So sure you're all well aware of a number of studies documenting just a huge amount of personal information online in different sites, Facebook, MySpace, LinkedIn, and many others. On Facebook alone, there's 3 billion photos a month and 60 million status updates daily. And despite all of this personal information, there's very little use of privacy controls, even when there are extensive privacy controls. And this isn't just an issue of sharing information with other people, but now a lot of this personal information is escaping the social network site itself and spreading beyond to third-party developers and to other sites through Facebook's application platform, and many other sites have implemented Google's open social platform as well. And so all of this sharing is, despite a lot of media attention over some of the problems with sharing and some very public negative consequences, like the MI6 chief's photos of his holiday and his swimming shorts, and a lot of other media attention around some of the dangers of social networking, like identity theft, stalking, spear phishing, for example. And there still seems to be a lot of sharing going on, a lot of users who don't seem to be all that concerned about their privacy. So I began my work really interested in, well, is that the case? Or do users really just not care? Why are they sharing so much information on these sites? What do they think about their privacy? And how do they manage it? How do they cope with their privacy online? And if there are issues, if there are needs that we can address, how can we make that management better? So my methodology through my work usually have started with a qualitative, formative study of a particular aspect of a social network site to understand the needs and behaviors of people, and then prototyped and evaluated new privacy mechanisms and interfaces to help address some of those needs. So you'll see that repeated throughout my talk, that methodology. So before I go on in the specifics of what I've done, it can be useful to at least address, well, what is privacy? And one of the challenges there is there's a lot of definitions, whether you're looking at it from a law perspective, a philosophical perspective, a social psychology perspective. Well, these are social network sites, so a lot of users' concerns are more of the social in nature. So, for example, looking at it as a boundary regulation process, so users figuring out, well, what they want to share and to whom based on the social circumstances. And the challenge when you move online is that it can be difficult to control those boundaries because you have to, a priori, set up those rules about, well, who can see what, and then the actual interaction occurs asynchronously and can occur after the fact. And as well, it affects the temporal boundaries. I mean, once you put something online, it stay there forever and be difficult to actually remove. So a definition, a framework I found very useful when thinking about privacy and social network sites is contextual integrity. This was proposed by Helen Nissenbaum as a way to explore and explain some of the privacy problems with public surveillance. So she was interested in explaining why if there's a camera videoing you in a public space and broadcasting that over the internet, why, even though you're in public, why people might still consider that a privacy problem and a privacy intrusion. And a lot of the current ethical or law frameworks did not really explain why that would still be a privacy issue if you're in public. So similar to a lot of the social psychology definitions, she posits that information sharing is governed by the social context. And there are norms about what is appropriate to share in that context. So she calls this norms of appropriateness. So for example, it's appropriate and even expected to share your medical history with your doctor, but not appropriate to share your full employment history, probably with your doctor. But it would be appropriate to share your full employment history with a potential employer and not your medical history. So it's not so much that one is more private than the other, but that there's different contexts in which one is appropriate and one is not. And the other kind of norm is how that information flows between parties. So that's norms of distribution. So again, it would be appropriate and expected for my doctor to share some of my medical information with my insurer in order to get paid, but not with my employer, even though my employer may pay for my insurance. So privacy problems then will occur when information that might be appropriate in one context is inappropriately shared in another. So again, it's not about, there's no necessarily information that's always public or always private, but it really depends on that context. I find this to be very appropriate to describe some of the issues in social networking because users are in a very social context. The challenge is that online, what that context is, the cues for what context you're in are different than they would be offline. And a lot of those cues are about, well, what kind of information flows are on the site? Who can access the information that I am posting or putting up there? And thus, what is the context that I am in? And that can be very difficult to explain. So this framework hasn't really driven my research, but I think we're not really trying to validate this particular definition, but instead I think it's been useful to help explain some of the results we've gotten and to point out some of the needs, which is to help make that context, what those information flows are, much more concrete, and so people can be more aware of them in order to improve what their privacy behaviors should be. Okay, so now to start with the studies and the work that I've done. So we started off looking at general profiles on social network sites and started looking at Facebook. As this was back in 2007, it was users were sharing a lot of their real information. It was not very anonymous. And they did have very homogeneous profiles with a lot of information and extensive privacy settings. So that's why we chose them. And we found that we did focused interviews with sets of users about their sharing and their profile usage and how they were managing that sharing and their profile. And we found that users were considering, they weren't just trying to share everything with everyone, they were considering what to post based on what was safe and acceptable to share. So safety for most of our participants meant not being able to be stalked or located by a stranger, which meant that they took a lot more care posting contact information than things like interests and books and activities that didn't matter to share with strangers. They couldn't find them based on that. And as far as what was appropriate, for a lot of these pieces of profile information, the purpose of that information was not so much for their good friends who already knew a lot about that person, but was really more geared towards new acquaintances, new friends, people they were meeting. And so what was appropriate was what they would be willing to share with someone they had recently met. So in that case, birthdays and hometowns were quite acceptable. And were shared quite a lot by our participants. Almost all participants shared their birthday and hometown. But interestingly, things like politics and religion were considered more private by some and were shared a lot less than birthdays and hometown. Now, if you have a security perspective, birthdays and hometown we consider to be pretty sensitive for a variety of reasons. So it's interesting, again, that because of that social context, users don't see it that way. In addition, it was easy to overlook the reach of your information. Users generally they created their profile, added a lot of information up front, thought about the broad audiences that might view it. But then as they went through their daily interactions, they interacted with a fairly small group of often close friends. And so sometimes made decisions based on sharing with those close friends, overlooking the fact that, well, there's a lot more people that can view that information. This is my favorite example. It was a participant who was talking about how they weren't really comfortable with strangers viewing their profile, so they took care with what they posted. And yet this was one of the few participants who actually posted fairly publicly. At the time, it wasn't completely public. It was open to the network, so it was open to all of UNC Charlotte. This was a student. He had his full phone number and address. And so my student actually directly asked him, well, why did you decide to share that? And he stated, well, it was because I changed phone numbers and moved, and I wanted to communicate with my friends. But, that actually probably wasn't a good idea. I should really take that down, and never thought about having strangers having access to it. And actually, after the study, he did set that as a friends-only piece of information. So we named this phenomenon, and I'm sure others have named it similarly, the shrinking perceived audience. So participants seemed to, at first, think about the broad audiences as they were creating their profiles and adding information, but as they went through their daily interactions, the actual mental model of who they were aiming for was their close friends, and they were overlooking the fact that, oh yeah, strangers can view it. So they were consciously aware. If you asked them, can strangers view your profile? Yes. But when it came down to those regular, individual decisions, that was overlooked. And this may have also been something that contributed to that. Cliff Lampe also did a study and found that students in particular didn't think that teachers and strangers would really be looking at their profile. Why would they want to? So that may also be another thing that's contributing to it. Even though, yeah, strangers could, but why would they be viewing my information? So what they were posting and their privacy behaviors were more based on this smaller audience. Participants also spent very little time sort of updating their settings and updating their profile, and really did that when something prompted reflection, and often that was something creepy happening. So a stranger contacted them, they were passed on campus, and someone said, "Hi, I saw you on Facebook." Someone started calling them, and that often resulted in privacy settings being changed or information being taken down. Interestingly, the study also caused that reflection. That wasn't a goal, but one of the nice things we did in this interview is not only do we have people sit down in front of their own profile, we asked them to view the profiles of other users. So we asked them to view profiles of 2 others in the study and of 2 that we controlled, and to talk about their impressions. What we wanted to see was what are impressions of people who have different privacy settings. So the ones we controlled we had set a number of privacy settings. We wanted to see what their reaction was. And in our daily lives, even if we're viewing people we don't know very well, we're usually not behaving in an evil manner. We're harmless. Even if we're snooping on someone, we don't consider that to be this strange behavior. Whereas in this study, we asked participants to look at people for no reason of their own, with an interviewer standing over their shoulder asking them what they thought. So they really felt like this sort of stranger, I think. So they really called out people who had a lot of information that maybe shouldn't have been posted on their profile, and then reflected on their own behavior. And yeah, strangers can view my profile. Maybe I need to change my behavior. And there were several who changed their privacy settings, not just the one from the previous example, who changed their privacy settings and became more private or took down information after our study. And that really wasn't our intention, but sort of an interesting aspect of how can we promote those occasional moments of reflection where people can readdress their privacy behaviors. So one of the implications of that study was the importance of having a more accurate mental model of your audience in mind as you are interacting on the social network site. So this led us to try and create a new interface for modifying privacy settings. Another result of that previous study was users had a hard time modifying the privacy settings of Facebook, and sometimes they were actually plain wrong. They thought they had done something and hadn't. So we also wanted to make something that was more usable and to promote more frequent modification of privacy settings. So we called this Audience View. And it basically presents your privacy settings as the view of your information from the various audiences. So you see, actually I can show you a live demo here. Ooh, where'd it go? Not working. There. Okay. This is just a Java prototype made to look like Facebook. It doesn't actually tie in to Facebook at all. So it's pretty basic. You have the audiences along the top, so friends, friends of friends, and this was the audiences at the time in Facebook. And then you can have subcategories like family or best friends that you define. So then you can go and view the information that these folks can see, and just click on the lockboxes to show and hide information. And you can set settings for a whole set of your friends, which will propagate down. And the yellow boxes say that one of the subgroups is shared and one of the subgroups is not shared. So that's the yellow sort of says there's a difference in the subcategories. So we thought that this would give, where's the, there. So our goal was to try and provide a more accurate and concrete mental model of the information sharing that's occurring. And there's a lot more visual feedback as to the impact of a privacy setting. It's very obvious. You click the lockbox, the information hides, it grays out, so it conveys a much more accurate mental model. So then we compared this with existing Facebook interface, and indeed users were able to modify their settings faster and with greater confidence than Facebook, and everyone preferred it when we compared it to Facebook. And they didn't really talk about usability or how easy it was, but instead talked about more their confidence and the control they felt. So it seemed like that visual feedback was really important to the users, and they really liked having that additional, what is the outcome of my making that decision? I want to talk about this since Rob's in the audience. We also then compared this with an alternative interface, which is Rob Reader's expandable grids. And if you're not familiar with that interface, it's a grid visualization. In this case, the audiences, the friends, the networks were across the top. And on the other axis was the sets of information. And again, in this case, we tied it to the sets of information that were in Facebook. And we compared these two interfaces. We were actually surprised by how few performance differences there were. Users in both were pretty much equally accurate and confident, took about the same amount of time despite how very different those representations were. But what did happen was users had a very clear and different preference. So those that preferred audience view liked the visual feedback and the more contextual nature of the interface. Those that preferred expandable grids liked having an overview all in one place. They felt like it would help them not overlook a particular setting. So, audience view is, encompasses a number of pages, and so there's some limitations there. It can only grow so much before it gets cumbersome. So we think the implications of this are that, well, users value and would probably be benefited by both a contextual kind of representation and a more compact, sort of see the forest kind of representation. And they may have different preferences for what they value at different times. So how can we combine the two and perhaps give them the best of both worlds? We haven't actually looked at how to combine audience view and expandable grids yet, so maybe we'll do that. But I think even for other kinds of privacy settings interfaces, being able to both have that visual feedback of the impact of your setting and not have to visit many, many, many pages in order to do so would be valuable. Yes?
Just a quick question. So, does this include also the information about the wall posts and controls about the wall posts, pictures, or is it just about the profiles?
So it did, to some extent, include things like the wall posts, although not individual wall posts. It included the whole wall. So I can go back to the screenshot here. Actually, if you see on the screenshot, in this case, the wall is hidden. So we did not get to the point of, well, any individual posts you make, you might want to set settings on. I think that's still very important, and that may get cumbersome in this type of interface, because you wouldn't want to see a list of everything, and you probably want to make that decision while you're posting and not in some separate interface. So it's another disadvantage of this interface, and also of expandable grids, is that it's a separate interface. You're not interacting with it while you are adding your information, while you're interacting with people on the site. It's still a separate activity. And so we're very interested in how we pull more of those decisions into the actual activity on the site itself, and we're working on that, but I think that's a very hard problem for something like, this very potentially complex set of privacy settings if you really did want to go fine-grained. So next we looked at photo sharing on social network sites. And the particular issue on social network sites with photo sharing is that lots of people are uploading photos, potentially of you, and tagging those photos so that they are now linking that photo with your profile. And now that photo is viewable on your profile. So your profile information is no longer fully controlled necessarily by you. Other people are making decisions as to the content of your profile. And so we imagined that there were some issues surrounding that and wanted to look at that in more detail. So again, we started with a formative study, a set of focus groups, and we talked to participants about photo sharing in general, but very quickly this very issue of people uploading photos that I don't like and being tagged in them, and what do I do about that? And very quickly, the notion of ownership came up. And the prevailing view was that those who took the photo or were uploading the photo were the owners. And they should have the right to do whatever they want with that photo. It's their photo. So if they want to upload it, they should share it. But they have more of a social obligation to respect the privacy and the wishes of those in the photo. So they would this prevailing view would likely reject any sort of privacy mechanisms where everyone's a co-owner and has equal say in how this photo should be viewed or shared or et cetera. They really did feel like the owners have more rights, but yet there's still somehow a social obligation that they have towards the people in the photo. Unlike general profile privacy settings, where people were concerned about strangers and stalkers, they were most concerned with people they already knew, people in their social circles. So this was about identity management more than anything. So, not surprisingly, the students didn't want their parents or siblings to see the partying photos. People didn't necessarily, always want their work colleagues to see some of their more personal photos. So it was about, managing the reach of that individual photo, the people who were already in your social circles. And there was also expressed almost a feeling of helplessness. Everyone had some story of some photo that they didn't want up, that someone had posted, and really felt like if you're on Facebook, even if you're not, you're going to have photos posted that you don't really appreciate being online by someone else, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Untagging does something, it at least removes the photo from your profile, but everyone was very well aware that it was still out there. Probably other people could find it. It may not be hard for your family to find that photo of you partying, even if it's not on your profile, because it's on your best friend's profile, for example. Yeah?
Well, arguably, untagging is the wrong thing to do. If it's tagged properly, then at least you have some control over the flow of information. If it's not tagged at all, then, all bets are. right?
Yes, and actually several participants expressed the privacy benefits of tagging because at least they knew there was a photo out there. They may not like it, but at least they were made aware that this photo existed and was out there. And if they really didn't like it, they could take some action offline. They had to, go and ask the owner to please take that down or something. But oftentimes that didn't work because, the owners felt like they had a right to share it. And so sometimes, depending on what the photo was and the relationship you had, people didn't feel as much of an obligation to actually take the photo down or do what you wanted with it. Yeah, Stuart.
So there are a lot of these questions where how users will respond will depend very heavily on the language you use. And the language of tagging makes it sound like, well, someone took a picture and now they're tagging it. Those are all things that belong to them. Whereas if you word the question, if someone takes a photo and wants to publicly associate your account with that photo, I think you'd get a very different response in a survey or in a focus group if things are worded in that way.
Right, and we were aware of that in that, and we wonder if on different sites this sort of prevailing view would be different because Facebook implies, the way Facebook is set up, the person who uploads the photo has more permissions, right? They're the ones who can choose album level permissions. They're the ones that can approve or deny tags. And so we're not sure if partly this view of owners having more rights is because of the way sites are currently set up. And if sites were made differently and had different language, if people would, one, disagree with and not use it, and two, have a different view of, well, maybe we should all be co-owners. If you're posting this picture, I want equal rights to it. But at least at the moment on Facebook, users seemed to feel very uncomfortable with the idea of manipulating someone else's photo. We had actually, as part of the focus group, put up showed them an interface where maybe you could blur out your own face to prompt discussion, not really as a potential solution, but really to prompt discussion around, we thought, they probably hadn't thought about a lot of privacy mechanisms. And they thought, well, that's neat, but I don't know that I'd really use that because of that, someone else is an owner, and I would really feel uncomfortable, except in some extreme situations, impacting someone else's photo. But again, that may partly be because of
tagging has nothing to do with the photo in some sense.
Right.
It's your right of privacy of your account not
Right.
associating with things you don't want your account associated
Yeah.
with. And this is a situation where you actually, if you think about other contexts that would allow this, users would find them outrageous, right? Someone can associate an email with you even though you never sent it, or
Absolutely.
I'm actually surprised that this is not one of the things that, say, Epic is focusing on when they're going after Facebook, because it's just so, from an architectural perspective, so glaring that what is normally a user's domain is not their domain in this particular case.
Yeah, and I think some of the users, perhaps their lack of concern over it is also because it's a very convenient way to share photos. And that convenience may be outweighing how in other contexts this would just seem like a very strange mechanism that, this content can be associated with your identity when you didn't upload it.
One last comment on that. I can't remember if this is right or not, but I thought you could set your preferences so that you had to approve anytime you're tagged. Do you know if that's right?
I don't think that's the case.
No? Okay.
You can set a privacy preference to show all tagged photos, but they're all grouped as one set of, all photos you are tagged in. You can set the settings for that, but that's an all or nothing. If you only have one photo you don't like, it doesn't really help there. It's a question in the back.
This may not be this may be a serious breach of privacy, but the old-fashioned alternative of having photos circulate on an email without the victim even knowing about it looks to me like worse. They said it's hard to find his ghosts.
Yes. So, and they did. And I've actually anecdotally known a couple people who joined Facebook just so they could monitor their photos. They knew pictures were up there of them. So at least if they were on Facebook, they knew it was there, and they could at least deal with it in other ways. It was also interesting. People talked about changing their physical behavior, avoiding the people who tended to take the photos that ended up on Facebook. So users were aware of this problem, but there was just a lot of helplessness expressed, and which was surprising. People really, and yet there's not a big uproar over it, so that's why I was surprised. Yeah, I'll take a couple last questions. We're moving on.
So speaking of having some sort of a recourse, I mean, there is this option to report a photo, whatever that means. Do you have any data on how often that's being used?
No, I don't have any data. And for all our participants, again, these are photos where they looked bad. I mean, they weren't the kind you would report. They were, I woke up in the morning and my hair was going crazy and my friends thought that was funny. Or I was drinking and my coaches, even though I'm legal age, I'm on a sports team, my coaches don't want drinking photos of me posted, even if they're very, even if there's nothing wrong with them. I'm just at a bar holding a beer. We're not supposed to do that. So it wasn't so much that seemed to be the concern of a lot of users, not the extreme case of a very inappropriate photo that might get reported.
Did you ask users about behavioral changes in response to a feeling of inability to control the release of this kind of photos? Like, don't go to the bar and drink heavily before a game that your coach doesn't want you to be seen drinking at?
They did comment on avoiding people's cameras when they were doing things that they didn't want to end up on Facebook. So a number of users commented on that, but not so much on the not doing the behavior in the first place so much. But this is also we didn't have a large number of participants either. So based on that study, we came up with a number of design considerations if you were to try and address some of these privacy issues with photo sharing. First, there was still a huge social value to photo sharing. They were willing to put up with all of these problems because they wanted to share their photos. And a lot of the issues were about identity management. Users generally can identify specifically who they don't want to see their photo. It's not so much about strangers in this case, usually. The tools would need to adhere to at least the notions of ownership that users have on that site in order to manage the tensions that are between these owners and tagged users and help them negotiate that. Users desire a way to take immediate action. And perhaps one way to manage this tension is to bring that negotiation into the privacy tools. Right now, there's really not a lot of negotiation. I can untag. But even then, people can retag, and a number of participants talked about that happening, it being a competitive cycle of untagging and retagging. And otherwise, that negotiation has to move completely out of the tool and offline if you really want a photo taken down. So how about bringing that negotiation in? So with these considerations in mind, we designed an additional mechanism. We think it's an additional tool in the toolbox. We called Restrict Others. And we wanted this to be a more collaborative negotiation between the owner and tagged users in order to hopefully change or at least reduce those tensions. We really wanted to put a little more tension on the owner to fulfill that moral obligation, as our participants referred to it as. So what this interface does, and this is just an interface prototype, it would allow a tagged user to specify who they would want this photo restricted from. And so individuals or groups of people that they wanted it restricted from. So that fits with, there's usually a set, and often it was a small set of people they didn't want to see that photo.
Coach Watson.
Yeah, exactly. Or your mom and dad or a small family group or work colleagues or church colleagues. That was the common one stated. And you can state an optional reason. And this would then send a message to the owner, and it would say, in this case, Heather wants to hide this photo from 6 users. It would not actually list out those names because that would be actually providing additional information that could be used for blackmail or other purposes. So that's almost too revealing. It's putting the tension back on the tagged user. And so, again, you notice this can take very quick action, and it tries to bring that negotiation into the interface. Yeah.
It strikes me that restricting who cannot see it is backwards. Blacklists usually don't work. And it should might instead be more effective if you say who can see it. And maybe tools that would explicitly take some people off of the safe list. But I'm concerned about you leave somebody off the blacklist.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason we went with the blacklist was, again, because most of our participants could name that list of, I don't want, mom, dad, brother, sister to see this. And it was usually actually fairly small. It wasn't a huge group. There were probably some of those photos, again, which they didn't want anyone to see because, they woke up at, this example was used multiple times. I just woke up and I looked terrible or whatever. My hair was looking awful. So it wasn't just about the drinking. This wouldn't necessarily be good for those. But for some of those others where it's that, the smaller social circles that they really didn't want to see, perhaps this would address those concerns. So yeah, I agree. This is a blacklist method, but it did seem to match some of the ways people were thinking about, I don't mind a lot of people seeing it, but, not mom and dad, not church, not whatever it was. And so we did evaluate, but this was a lab study. We implemented that interface prototype as a Facebook application, so it could access users' actual photos. So we asked them to choose one of their photos and play the role of restricting others. They knew it wasn't going to actually work. So this was a role playing, even though they were operating on their own photos. They seemed to understand the interface. We didn't give them any training. And felt like it was lightweight and would be fairly easy to use. It takes a little more time than untagging, so they reported, well, that would take a little more effort. Well, untagging is one button. This you actually have to list out the users. But they did appreciate the fact that it was more collaborative. It couldn't be undone. Someone couldn't retag me again. And then we asked them to play the role of an owner and sent them a request as though it had been sent to them. And would you allow this person to deny this from, I can't remember how many users we said, 6, 8, something like that. And many said, I don't see why I wouldn't in that case. Seems silly. So they did seem to feel like in many cases that was a reasonable request and that they would want to satisfy that. But there were still a few participants who did not, who said no, deny. And their reasons were interesting. A couple of them said, well, this doesn't seem like a very dangerous photo. There's nothing going on here. Why would someone want to hide that photo from anyone? And others said, well, I don't really know these people in the photo, so why would I care? So there does seem to be, this is relying on having social consequences. And so if you don't know the person, you don't care about what they think, you're not likely to feel like you have any sort of social obligation to protecting their privacy. But perhaps if you do, and it seems like a reasonable request, you would be likely to grant that.
Was this a study where they were working on real photos of their real friends, or was it just a made-up photo?
So when they requested, when they did the restricting themselves, it was on their real photos. We had intended that a message would get sent about their real photo, but the API changed like a couple days before the study and we didn't realize it. And we had a default in there, if it couldn't find one of their photos, it would choose one of ours. They all got sent one of our photos that had me and my student in it. And so that's where I think those who said it would be reasonable were playing that role. They were thinking of themselves in that role. Those who said it wasn't were looking at this photo going, what's wrong with this photo? I don't know these people. I don't care. So in the end, I actually think it was kind of good because we saw, if you don't have that social consequence, this mechanism isn't going to necessarily work either. But if you do, and many users thought, well, in a real situation, I might. Again, it's a lab study. I would really like to deploy this because, as I've talked about it, there's a lot of subtleties that people have brought up. So, for example, well, if I'm the owner, I might want to know, I actually don't care so much if my friend hides it from all the people who aren't in my social circle. I don't care. I'm not really trying to share it with them anyway. So who cares if they want to hide it from people who I don't know? But if they're trying to hide it from my best friend, I might want to know that. And so I think there's some interesting places where this may need to be, I don't know. I think we would need a deployment study in order to be able to tell how much in practice users would really employ that and what some of these subtleties might be when they start to look at 6 users. Well, who are those people? Would they really accept that, or would they start to ask questions or not? Yeah, Stuart.
This is an interesting interface because in order to protect personal information, I have to elicit more personal information. Mm-hmm. That is, I have to tell you who it is that I'm sensitive about and where there may be potential tension, or so I have to give up. What I'm giving up may be worse than what I'm trying to protect in the first place, and that now I have to say, yeah, there is some tension between me and this person, or this is the person I really don't want the sketchy photos to go to. So if there's not a great relationship of trust there, I might be doing more damage to myself by using this interface, because now you know exactly where to hit me.
Yeah,
than
I agree.
by not using it.
I agree. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think this is potentially one additional tool, but it clearly doesn't work for all situations where you don't have a social relationship, where the person you're trying to hide it from, there's some tension going on there. I agree. So I think there's room for other mechanisms. This is what we came up with when we really sort of tried to go through those considerations, but then that presents itself with its own list of potential issues. So the participants all seemed to like the idea of it and came up with, when being interviewed, yeah, I could see there being a few photos where I might actually want to use that, but it's not going to cover everything. So I think that's one of the challenges here, is that because of these social relationships and how this all interplays with your identity management and people having this different ownership tension going on, one solution isn't going to fix all of them unless you went to this very, I think, complex model of co-access control. But then I don't think users would use that because it's too complicated, and again, they might rebel against, well, it's their photo. I don't really want to be setting my settings for that. So I don't know what the solution is to cover everything. I think we need more investigation here.
I think part of the reason that they're reasonably comfortable with this is because they seem to exhibit a great deal of trust in the provider, right? So they said, now Facebook, as Stuart is pointing out, knows what their weaknesses are in some sense, and if Facebook decided to, someday you get an email from Facebook that says, well, either you put $1,000 in a hollow tree, or we'll reveal this photo to this your worst enemy, right? If that were the situation, then they would be very much uncomfortable with doing it this way. And the other thing that comes out of this is that you're proposing a mechanism that does blacklisting, not whitelisting. And I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, again, the blacklisting seemed to go along with how users were talking about who, they wanted to hide it from a few people. They weren't really thinking, it was, again, it's not every photo that we're talking about. There's always a few of those photos you don't want up there, and they really seem to think, well, I'd rather hide it. That was their conception. Now, again, that could be impacted by how the current sites work. But we were trying to at least see if we could reflect that and what participants would think about that. I agree with you in the trust of the site. We were looking at, for both of these sets of the general profile and the photos, we weren't looking at trust and privacy with respect to more the data privacy, the fact that Facebook has access to this, and what do I want Facebook to have access to? People do seem to trust the site for good or bad, and so we were not looking at that issue in these particular sets of studies. Even looking beyond that issue, there's still issues of privacy with just how other users can access my stuff. So we were more interested in that.
About this. One of them is, did any users that you talked to ever think about any legal mechanisms that might be put into place to help them manage privacy and punish people who violate their wishes? And that would get at the Facebook thing as well. And then the other thing is, if you imagine that there's pretty much no way you can possibly control every leak of information about you unless you have no friends and you live in the desert by yourself, away from all electronic communication and satellites, then could you think about, what would you think about a system that helps people manage the spin of a leak rather than managing whether or not there's a leak at all?
So dealing with your first question, we didn't ask really people about law and legal and policy questions. So, and they didn't really volunteer any. So, but I think that was also, we weren't really asking them about that. The second question, I think that's a great idea. And we have, in my group, talked about more general mechanisms, not just, we were focused again on this very small piece of, photo sharing. There's personal information all over the place on a variety of sites. How would you manage all of that? Have an overview. But we haven't yet we haven't done a lot of work in that. So I think that's a great idea and something that would be very interesting to investigate. Okay, so the last domain on social network sites that we looked at was social applications. This is the application platform that many of you are probably familiar with. You download a third-party application, and it plays a game, or it does a survey, or it offers some service to you. And the interesting thing with applications is I think this is a place where users consider themselves to be in this social context still of the rest of the social network site. They're sharing with their friends. And yet there's some additional privacy implications having to do with the fact that these third-party developers are getting access to this. And now this personal information is flowing off of Facebook to other places. So we wanted to look at this particular problem. So just in case you're not very familiar with how the application platforms work, Google's Open Social operates very similarly. And there's some differences depending on how the site implements it. But in general, an application that you authorize can pull a lot of your profile data in order to do some service. So perhaps this one, it would give you back a movie recommendation. In addition, it can pull the information from your friends, depending on their settings. So it could pull profile information from, say, Bob and Charlie, and they have not authorized this application and are not aware necessarily that you are even using it. And this might be useful. For example, it could generate a movie recommendation that the three of you could watch together. But the problem with this is that when you authorize an application, this is just one list. This isn't even complete. It changes also all the time of all of the stuff you are giving that application, potentially giving that application, whether it needs it or not. And there are some back-end mechanisms, but in general, I don't think they're particularly strong, and you could make a good case for a lot of pieces of data why you might need it. And so we suspected most users had no idea that this was going on. So we wanted to look at this a little more quantitatively. And again, anecdotally, I was asked a lot about this when people heard I was dealing with Facebook privacy, and they really judged based on this little statement here. It's pulling your profile information that it requires to work, not anything that it wants to. So that's pretty ambiguous, but they were really taking that to mean, well, if it's not really if it doesn't make sense to use, my birthday, why would it pull my birthday? It shouldn't be able to do that. So that seemed to be how people were forming their mental models. They could also read blurbs, on the privacy policy and on this is a screenshot from a few months ago. I think it's probably changed by now, on just what applications do and how the platform works, but that didn't seem to be getting into people's understanding. So we gave a survey and to really find out what they thought was being shared. And so we asked them both about applications they had installed and applications their friends had installed. And this is applications their friends they had installed or they had authorized. And the correct answer is yes. They have access to all of this. And as you can see, they were pretty high on thinking, oh yeah, my name and picture was able to be accessed. But when it came to other things like, marketplace listings, significant other, a lot of, moved to a lot of the know and don't know. So they really didn't understand. They were potentially giving all this information. And then when we asked about applications their friends had installed, for the top 3, that's yes. That information is public. You can't really prevent other applications from accessing it. The rest do depend on your privacy settings. We did look at a number of our participants. We were also doing an interview. We did look at our participants' settings, and most of them had the default open settings. So these should have been very high. So actually isn't always yes. It depends on your settings, but most of them allowed it. So they don't know.
What percentage of people answered yes to all of those? Did anyone just go yes all the way down?
No, they did not. And we asked a few things that Facebook didn't have on its site. So and these weren't in this order. We ordered them based on the no's. But they were.
Yes, pretty much.
Right. Yeah. No one did that. No one said yes. Your social security number was shared, and we had a few others on there that were not shared because we did want to ensure that happened. And I don't remember. We did look at were there people. Was it that a couple people got it all right, and then other people were very wrong? And it really did seem. I don't remember if even one person got it all right. So I think there was just general confusion. 20-something. 20-something? No, more than that. No, I think 25.
They're all divisible by 4.
24 then, maybe. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering. So we also asked, okay, well, who do you think you're sharing with? Not surprisingly, many thought it was mostly their friends. Again, that social context. They seem to be judging based on their interaction with applications. You know, they've seen applications, okay, they seem to have my name, my photo. They seem to have my friends' photos, a lot of the ones I use. But probably, I don't know if anyone had ever used an application that accesses your marketplace or your significant other. And then we asked, well, what would you be willing to share? So despite the confusion and really thinking they were mostly just sharing with their friends, they did seem to be not so sure. They still, most reported, they didn't really want to share everything. So, you know, name and picture seemed okay, but as we got down to, and we had the whole long list, but this is just a subset of them. You know, some of the ones like political views and work history, no reason to share them. And so, you know, this is not reflecting their behavior and what's actually happening on the platform.
At all to hypothesize about what scenario could you come up with why you would want to share this piece of data with advertisers?
No, we didn't ask that. We did ask in general what your concerns were with application usage and sharing information with applications. And most people, again, reported the identity management stuff, you know, sharing, you know, results of surveys with people who, you know, about, you know, what animal I'm like. I don't want everyone on my social network seeing that. That's where more of their concerns. A few people came up with more advertising. I don't want businesses to get my data for advertising. And only one person really came up with the, you know, people being able to do more malicious things like identity theft. And even that wasn't because developers already had access to it. It was, he came up with a scenario of, you know, someone would make an application where they could pose as a woman and then get all this information out of me. So not a single participant, you know, had even sort of a rudimentary understanding of that all this information is flowing off of Facebook potentially to other developers.
What is the age range or general breakdown of your population?
We did have, probably the majority were college aged, but then we did have, I'm trying to think, I'm not remembering very much now. We did have a number of users in late 20s, early 30s, and early 40s. So we tried to get away from the university for some of that. So they weren't all students, and even some of the students were older. But they were not the full, they were not a full representative sample of Facebook's population.
Let me kind of try to ask a converse question, if you will, which is Facebook itself, to refocus on the provider again, knows a tremendous amount about you. I mean, these applications, some of them are shady, and, you know, I understand the situation here. But MySpace, for instance, if you post an ad on MySpace, if you use MySpace as your advertising platform, you can, you know, do things like target, I don't know, expecting mothers with, you know, products are appropriate for that category.
Same with Facebook.
Same with Facebook, right? So, I mean, did you ask them to see if the quality, the increased quality of ads, the relevance of ads that they get because of Facebook knowing so much about them, do they see that as you know, boon of some sort, or do you see that as a negative?
We didn't ask that question, and none of our questions really came close to addressing that particular aspect, so I think that'd be an interesting question. Again, there seems to be this implicit trust of Facebook, although we didn't dig into that, and I think that would be very interesting to look at.
Can you talk about how you might assess the strength of conviction that the study participants have about their feelings toward privacy? Like, if you try to convince them that it was a good idea to give out your political views to software developers, like, how hard would you have to try to get them to go ahead and do it? Like, money, or?
Oh, that'd be interesting. Yeah, that would actually be quite interesting. All we've done is just we've always used the Weston survey just to kind of make sure we had the traditional breakdowns of pragmatists and fundamentalists, but we never really tried to push on people's what they'd be willing to give away for privacy. I think that would be an interesting study to look at and see if that correlates to their behaviors. Facebook. Yeah, I think that'd be interesting. So I'm not really answering your question, but I'd like to move on so I can get to the last solution here. So our first solution was, well, they're giving away everything. Well, let's at least provide some more fine-grained access control. And can we do that in a way at the sort of the authorization stage where people would find this lightweight and would actually interact with it, and then would help them build a mental model of what's being accessed or not. So in this interface, it pulls your concrete information. It's not just saying, well, it's your friends. It's actually pulling the information so you can see what's being shared. It's also picking a random friend to give you the awareness that you're also sharing potentially your friend's information, and it's filling that in. And then you can check and uncheck the boxes to share information. So fairly straightforward sort of access control. But if this would work, if users would be willing to actually check and uncheck those boxes and modify their policies. Otherwise, they're just going to accept whatever the application asks for. And we wanted to look at what strategies might they use, and would they actually go about protecting themselves? Would it increase their awareness of everything? So we tested this by simulating the installation experience. So again, we built that as a Facebook application so it could pull people's real information to populate the interface. We told them they were testing an application container that had additional capabilities, and we wanted them to install or authorize 11 random applications. And then we varied the scenarios from being, having short policies, long policies, being very sort of appropriate to the context of the application, and things that just looked very inappropriate, and wanted to see what people would do. So we found there were really two sets of users, and we weren't trying to categorize perfectly, but really more qualitatively describe what was going on. There was about half our users modified some of their policies. They unchecked boxes in this case. We went with a default to share. So they unchecked boxes. And the other half went through all 11 and just hit accept, 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 accept for the most part. So they weren't really motivated to interact with the interface. And on the left, this is an application where what we asked for was fairly appropriate. It was still sensitive information. It was appropriate for the application. So a horoscope would ask for your birthday. And even the people who were modifying their policies still shared things that were appropriate. We actually thought hometown was appropriate because it would, what stars you were born under or whatever. Turned out it wasn't so much. Those who were more motivated chose not to add that. And I think the person here in the unmotivated group actually had a horoscope application already, so they chose not to add it because they already had one, not so much because of a privacy decision. This was one that we asked for very inappropriate data that had made no sense for what the application did. And as you can see, a lot of the motivated users actually did not share some of this information that did not make sense. Even though they still added the application. A number of them added the application, but just restricted that sharing. So it seems like, well, just having this access control type of interface, some users will use it and they will protect themselves more and actually as a response potentially protect their friends based on how we propose this mechanism would work. But they also seem to not pay too much attention if they didn't have the piece of data filled in on their profile. That could be a problem if later they went back and added that information to the profile. They might forget that they were already sharing it. And the biggest problem was still that, this authorization seems to occur before they ever get to the application. So they're making a decision based on the name. Almost no one went and looked at the application information. They didn't read the explanations for why they wanted that data. They made very fast decisions, and they judged based on the name, and they wanted to get to the application and through the process. And we think that's fairly realistic, even though this was a lab study. And so we're now thinking about, well, how can we move this decision past authorization point and let users express these privacy settings as they're interacting with the application. So that's something we're currently working on. So that's one of my next steps, and I'll try and summarize here real quickly. Another is we're also trying to look at some more general mechanisms, not for specific types of social network site policies that might help users make privacy decisions. And this is work that's going to be presented next week at the Symposium on Usable Privacy and Security. We were looking at, this should look familiar, it's the application access control. But what we put on that we just thought would be interesting is this bar. But we didn't test it in our last study. So this study was all based around, well, would this bar change users' decision? Would they take that into account in making their decision as to whether to share information or not? So, and this is called social navigation. This is an example of social navigation, using other users' behavior to help inform your own. So we set up a study around just that, a controlled experiment, used Mechanical Turk to get a good number of users, and found that just this bar didn't have any impact that we could find based on our sample. But it did have somewhat of an impact if you made it much stronger, the cue much stronger, by painting this red line across the whole data field to show that you were sharing something that the majority of people weren't. And that did have an impact, but still not a large impact. There was probably 20% less sharing of those data items, and users didn't really report that they paid a lot of attention to it. It was sort of middle of the road. They noticed it, but didn't think it was really impacting their decisions much. So it seems to have a modest impact, and it might be useful. It's a very simple mechanism, but it needed to be really strong. And some of the things I'm interested in now are, well, was it the actual social mechanism, or was it just that there was a red bar there? And if you manipulate what that red bar means, how much does that impact their decision? So that's sort of our next step there is looking at these kinds of cues that might help people make decisions. Okay, so in conclusion, I think all my work has really been about yes, users are sharing a lot, but they still have privacy issues. They still have privacy concerns and needs, and I think we can do a lot with creating additional, more usable interfaces. Create that better awareness of their context. So even if they're not manipulating privacy settings, perhaps they're choosing what to post with a more awareness of where it's going, so they will have fewer privacy intrusions. And we're continuing to look at how to provide more general guidance to users in making privacy policy decisions, and to pull those decisions closer to their regular interactions and activities on a site, instead of still as separate policies and interfaces. So since I'm at an hour, I will want to thank all my students whose work I'm really representing here, and all my collaborators, and I will take some additional questions.
Suppose we could miraculously come up with an interface where everyone completely understands what is exposed and is very happy with it, it's very intuitive. Isn't there a very good argument saying that this is absolutely the last interface that Facebook is going to use? I mean, the confusion is not unintentional. The ambiguity is there for a reason, because they have a very powerful incentive for you to be confused about exactly what you've exposed, and they will always bias it toward your exposing. You're always going to be surprised that you've exposed more rather than less. And when you finally figure it out, they just change everything. I mean, isn't that the fundamental problem here?
I think there is a fundamental problem there, yes, because the sites who are building their businesses off of our personal information have motivation to get us to share as much of it as possible. So I agree with you, and I don't actually expect necessarily Facebook to implement many of these. However, it's also up to the consumer to choose which sites they use. They have choice. Yes, there are network effects and all of that, but I don't think Facebook is here to stay necessarily for the long haul. We've seen already users are very fickle and will jump. So I do think if privacy can become more of a commodity to users, there will be more incentive. So I think an interesting fundamental issue is, how do we help users to value and understand that, so that it does become more of a commodity, they do demand it, and then they go to those places where they have more usable interfaces, better sites.
I guess showing that, if you can show that there's an interface that is much more intuitive and that people respond to much better than what's out there, at least it demonstrates the gap between what's available and what they're using, which would itself be useful.
Yeah, so I think there's potential. There's also potential with policy, policy being stronger and more influential, and sites at least having to show they're doing a little more than they're doing. But again, I think it's going to fall back on the consumer, which, we've all shown there's issues with privacy. People are willing to give away their information to get useful stuff in return. So I don't have a necessarily a solution yet, but and I don't want to pick just on Facebook. It's been a very easy platform to study because of the application platform. That's why we've used it so much. We're trying to get away from Facebook, and we are looking at other sites and also looking at mobile the mobile platform. There's a lot of the same application-oriented issues going on there. But yeah, I agree with you.
Intel have a policy that from time to time they pick on a random guy's computer and say, pretend XYZ company has sued us and we're doing a pre-trial discovery. Have you thought of similar red team attacks like fake Steve's classic Dukes ad absurdum on Beacon?
I think that would be interesting. I think that tends to work when you have an authority who can do those attacks. So if you are within an organization, they can do those attacks. And there are for a lot of different kinds of security issues, phishing, there's been a lot of proposed solutions to do that. I haven't looked at that. It'd be interesting to see how much users respond in this case to, if I could see them responding positively if it's their social network site usage that's related to the company. But if it's their personal, say, Facebook profile page, would they appreciate some organization trying to teach them about what they should and should not?
Here's our team. Invite them and you like it.
Yeah. But it might cause that same kind of reflection that our first study did as well. So. Yeah.
So in the realm of experimental computer science, so the previous question, have you thought of assessing the sort of financial cost that people put on their privacy kind of setup? So like for instance, here's what I'm imagining, it's an application, right? So there's an application that says, well, sell me your privacy. And every time I go and update one of those knobs, it gives me, $5. And then, let's find out how much I'm willing to pay to reveal more and more about myself.
Yeah, so there have been some studies of that, and there's a whole group of people in behavioral economics who study things like that. So the one that's coming to mind that's been most recently within HCI was a group at CMU, looked at, well, if you had you may be familiar with it, Serge Egelman, is that his last name? Serge, yeah. He looked at, if you had,
I think this is Janice's work that you're talking about.
The location privacy or phishing?
No, actually it was where they looked at, would people buy items from a site based on if the privacy ratings, and so how much would they be willing to pay based on the privacy rating? And so there are people doing those kinds of experiments. Again, I think they're very interesting to look at commoditizing and really look at the economics around privacy. That hasn't been something I've done yet. So, John.
Yeah. So just to, sort of following this thread, you can easily imagine putting together a team that will go into your site and discover a vulnerability, but can you put together a team that can go into a site and discover what social value you're getting from sharing this stuff? I mean, as in the case of photos, as you mentioned, 3 million a month that are going up there. We can all find 3 that are disastrous, but there may be 3 billion that are actually. So I guess that's the flip side. If we focus too much on the easily discovered problems, who's out there measuring the benefits from sharing? The social capital.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the interesting things about privacy is it is related to sharing. I mean, for especially a lot of these sites, the two are in some ways one and the same. I'm sharing, and I'm not sharing with you, and I'm sharing with you, and that is a definition of privacy. So, a lot of our studies we've asked about sharing, not so much about privacy, to try not to get them to think too securely and say things that might, I should be a private person, so I should say that. But I think it's hard to get at both of those things at once still because there's a lot of issues going on around the same thing, and different information is different, and different sites are different. So, I agree with you. We've also talked about, and we never haven't implemented this yet, and there are aggregators that will go through and sort of give you a view of all the stuff that's accessible on you. Okay, well, what if you could do that? Well, what would you want to do with that information then? What's the next step after that? Do you want all of this stuff out there? How would you go and now hide it and set your settings and all from one place? So you can think of your whole online persona and identity as instead of this site and this site and this site and this site. And I think that's something that I would suspect we'll see more and more of as more and more people join more and more sites. We're just all very separated. Some of that's good, but it's getting harder and harder to manage all these different pieces of content on the different sites. Rob?
Related to a couple of the other questions, one thing I really wonder about is, I think all of us as privacy researchers think, oh, privacy is like really, really important, right? But to an average user, is it really an attribute they would use to jump sites? Is it that important to them? Are they mostly concerned with all the other attributes of social networking, like how easy it is to share photos and how many of their friends are on it and all that stuff? Where does privacy kind of rank in the list of all the attributes people use to choose?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting in following the progression of Facebook in some regards. A lot of people who, again, our first study was 3 years ago, they talked about Facebook, MySpace, and we asked them if they had other sites. And they said they liked Facebook because it felt more private and closed. And they were more willing to be themselves. Now, those are the earlier adopters. I think social network effects have taken over, and now everyone's on Facebook. At least in the US, that's very prevalent. And I've also seen, just in the past few months, again, this is anecdotal, I haven't studied this, but a lot more people being more upset at Facebook and privacy and being more uncomfortable with what Facebook's doing. Even though really their privacy settings, they've gotten a little more public, but you can still be pretty much the same you were several years ago. The settings are not any more complicated than they were last year, even though suddenly now Facebook's having to change them to respond to all this media criticism. So I think it's going to come and go, but I think users, if there was a site that offered them everything else but was more private, I suspect they'd switch. That will not happen exactly. So it is one of many factors, and how to judge what those factors are. I mean, you've also that group out of, was it NYU or MIT, who was making the distributed social network site. They've gotten a lot of press and support, again, because you're in control of your information. I think if there were alternatives, then we'll see. But I don't have a quantitative answer to that, but I think that'd be interesting to study. So I do think it is an aspect that people will consider.
Yeah, I mean, Facebook may not be terribly motivated to, sort of help with this necessarily, or they have their own angle on it. But other people can create apps for Facebook that might help, right? So what's the current state of, I don't know, sort of the pool of applications for Facebook that, I don't know, tell you who's been looking at your profile or,
Well, so the challenge of the applications is they have access to your profile, but they can't affect your privacy settings.
Right, but they could make you aware.
Right, they could give you a report of if another user looked at your application. Right. But they couldn't give you a report if another user looked at your
Right, but could they do kind of like I'm thinking, I installed a virus checker and it runs through my whole computer and says, no, but you're clean, right? You could write an app that could run through and say,
and there was one.
Warning, warning.
Well, there was one recently.
I'm wondering if things like that exist or what's the state of that?
I haven't done a scan. I haven't seen very many. I have seen one that would go in. This was a few months ago. It would go in and check, again, because it was an application, it had access, it would check what it had access to. And so it would prompt you to modify your settings. And then I saw people passing that around through the newsfeed. But that's the only one I've seen. So I think it's still difficult. The app may be able to access profile information, but it still can't read everything, all the internals of Facebook. So I don't think there's been too much of that. And I also think more of us need to try and be creative and think about how to spread that awareness more. So I think there's both.
All right, let's thank Heather for her time.
Thank you very much.